My name is Giacomo Tajuri. I'm a Max Weber Fellow in the Law Department here at EY, and I'm one of the organizers of this workshop together with other Max Weber Fellows, Artur Dolgopolov from Economics, Agnieszka Jablonowska from Law, and Francesco Ducci also from Law. By way of introduction, before we go into our first panel, I wanted to say a few words on our motivation for this workshop and also on our approach to multidisciplinarity. By way of introduction, our idea for organizing the workshop is born out of the observation of the incredible amount of interest that in popular press, in policy discussions, and in different academic disciplines surrounds the transformation of prices in the digital economy. Most of the attention goes into the challenges and opportunities presented by algorithmic prices and price personalization. These topics have become, so to say, fashionable, and many different researchers from different traditions are now approaching them. In this context, we decided that a valuable contribution would be to enlarge our focus and treat price personalization and algorithmic prices as just the present specific manifestation of a broader theme, which is the role of technology in determining not only how markets work, but also the kind of consequences that markets produce. This is why we decided to call the conference PriTech, Pricing Technologies. And with this, we indicate the technologies that go into the determination of the price, such as, let's say, the algorithm in itself, technologies for the communication and display of prices, like, for example, electronic shelf labels, as well as technologies that are used to acquire relevant information that feed into the formation of the price, such as various forms of consumer profiling. We believe this focus will allow to better put the present concerns around algorithmic prices and price personalization in context and advance our common understanding of the current debate. As our panels illustrate, the technologies that feature in the formation and communication of prices have an impact on efficiency, welfare, and distributive outcomes, which are the core concerns of economics and partly also of certain legal traditions such as competition law. But these technologies also enable various processes of social discrimination with potential negative consequences on privacy, autonomy, and fairness, which is what interests mostly other legal traditions such as private law and consumer law. More broadly, they impact on social relations and culture, which is where the perspective of sociologists and historians that we also have in our conference come in. And this brings me to my second point, which I want to emphasize, which is multidisciplinarity. Let's say that multidisciplinarity is the main philosophy behind the Max Weber program at EY that hosts us today. Artur is an economist. Agnieszka, Francesco, and I are legal scholars, but different types of legal scholars. And thanks to these, we were able to bring together a different perspective and approaches to our theme. The idea of the workshop is exactly to track and map how different disciplines approach debates about pricing technologies and what are the different concerns each discipline voices. And I want to emphasize again that we add to the dominant disciplines of economic and legal scholarship to which we come voices from sociology, history, computer sciences, and also the voices of industry participants. So we believe that both our broader focus to prices and technology and the multidisciplinary mapping we have tried to put together can really enrich the research agenda of many scholars and researchers working on these topics. So we really hope that today and tomorrow, an economist may be inspired by the kind of work done in social legal studies or consumer law, and that legal scholars will learn from the most recent advances in economic theory, computer sciences, and vice versa. As you see, the lineup is very excited. We have many economists, mostly microeconomic theorists and industrial organization scholars, but also game theorists and scholars using experimental, behavioral, and empirical approaches. And for this incredible lineup of economists, we have to thank mostly Artur Dolgopolov. Then we have some of the key players in debates in competition law, consumer law, privacy scholars, and also sociology. And one computer scientist, Christo Wilson, whose talk is already recorded and available on our website. So if you're interested in his contribution, you can go and watch it at any time. Before I give the word to Francesco, who's moderating the first panel, I want to thank all of our speakers and also the audience, and also Joshua Grewal from the Max Weber program, who's helped us in putting this together. Sometimes people say, oh, it would have been nice to have this event in person, but today I think our event is really enabled by technology, as we have scholars joining us from Israel, Australia, the United States, Europe. So it couldn't have been done without distant communication technology. For what concerns housekeeping, I will let each moderator remind the key terms of these. But I now give the word to Francesco Ducci, who's going to moderate our first panel, and we go straight into our first panel, I think. Unless my co-organizers want to say something.
Hi everyone, I can jump in. Welcome to the first panel of this two-day pre-tech workshop. In this session, we welcome three speakers. We have two legal scholars and one economist who will discuss some of the challenges that algorithmic pricing poses for competition policy and regulation. We start the panel with Rob Nicholls, who is an associate professor in regulation and governance at the Business School of the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Rob researches in the area of competition policy, regulation of network industries, financial services, and tech sectors. And his presentation today will focus on a very topical issue, namely the use of AI in arbitration disputes between some of the large big tech firms and new news media businesses in Australia, in particular with regard to pricing disputes. After Rob, we have Giacomo Calzolari, who is a professor of economics here at the European University Institute, as well as research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy and Research. Among other things, Giacomo works in industrial organization and has published important papers on algorithmic pricing, one of them published on Science. And building on this work, today Giacomo will discuss some of the limitations with the existing policies and some potential solutions to the economic issues that are raised by AI pricing. And finally, we welcome Michal Gal, who is professor and director of the Law and Markets Forum at the Faculty of Law, Haifa University in Israel. She is also chair of ASCOLA, the Academic Society for Competition Law. She has published very widely in the field of competition law, including important papers on algorithmic collusion. So her presentation today will focus on the legal responses to new pricing technologies, what can be done with existing laws, but also some of the unresolved legal challenges that we face today with regard to AI pricing and collusion. In terms of format, each presenter will have 20 minutes to present. And after the three presentations, we will open to Q&A. If you have any question, my preference would be to write in the chat the word question, so I can easily keep track of the queue. And then we can open up for any type of question, both related to particular presentations, but also about general themes that connect them together. So I think since it's almost 10, I think we can start. Rob, the floor is yours. If you have slides, I'm happy to help you with screen sharing.
Okay, thanks very much. And what I'll do is cheat, and hopefully you can see those. And if you, all I need to do is to make me the presenter. Can you make me solves the problem? Wonderful, fabulous. That's great. So thanks very much. And it's really great to be here virtually. As we've already heard, I'm physically here in Australia, actually in Sydney, but a little bit of an outlier in a number of ways. Some of them are really great, like near zero COVID cases. Some of them are a little bit more difficult, like the recent floods, and have to say ongoing rain might cause some background noise. Some of them are a little bit odd, like our interesting approach to price discovery in a complex environment, which I'll come on to during the course of the talk today. As in many other parts of the world, there's an identified problem in Australia as to the absence of financial rewards given to news creators by news curators. We can be a little bit more specific here. The news curators are Facebook and Google. The news creators are all of the other news media businesses. In the European Union, this issue was dealt with as a copyright issue under the Copyright Directive. Under that directive, there's a license fee paid by the platforms to the news media businesses for content. Alternatively, as was negotiated in both France and the UK, there could be a commercial solution such as Google News Showcase. In Australia, the view was slightly different. Here, there was a realization that there's a bargaining imbalance between either Google or Facebook on the one hand and the news media businesses on the other. This, of course, leads to a little bit of an issue. It's quite hard to argue that a business owned or controlled by Rupert Murdoch should be on the losing side of a bargaining imbalance. It's also quite difficult to properly characterize what the imbalance is. After all, it's not a clear supply relationship. Each of Facebook and Google uses news content in a completely different way. In both cases, there are links back from the Google ecosystem and the Facebook ecosystem to the news media businesses' websites. So, how did we get here? Well, in December 2017, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, or ACCC, was directed to consider the impact of digital platforms on competition in the media and advertising services market. This was known as the Digital Platforms Inquiry. Now, this was a process that took a little while. The ACCC published an issues paper in 2018, February 2018, a preliminary report in December 2018. It issued a lot of statutory notices. These are requirements for businesses to reveal information, much like a discovery process in a legal case. And it had a series of forums as part of the inquiry. And the report was provided to the Australian Treasurer in June 2019 and made public in late July 2019. The report made 23 recommendations in 7 specific areas of competition. Only one of these recommendations looked at platforms and the news. And the key issue, for today at least, was the ACCC's proposal to have a voluntary, very important, code of practice regarding the power imbalances, bargaining power imbalances between the digital platforms and news media businesses. A voluntary code means that the industry has the opportunity to develop new rules by itself. Now, the government directed the ACCC to work with stakeholders to develop and implement voluntary codes to address the power imbalance, and the ACCC was tasked with providing a progress report on code negotiations in May 2020. And the original idea was that the code should be finalized no later than November 2020. Now, back in December 2019, the government reserved the right to impose a mandatory code if agreement wasn't reached. Each of Facebook and Google made some promises early on and said, well, we've got these products. Facebook had a news product. Google had Google's news showcase. We could bring these to markets. But the ACCC wasn't convinced. And perhaps not terribly surprisingly, there was no agreement. And as a result, the chairperson of the ACCC advised the Treasurer that he thought it was very unlikely that there would be an agreement, and the mandatory code process was started. On the 31st of July last year, the ACCC released its draft mandatory bargaining code. This allowed news businesses to bargain individually or collectively with Google and Facebook for payment for news used on platforms. To be eligible, a news business must have employed journalists and earned more than about 90,000 euros per year in news revenue, 150,000 Australian dollars, 90,000 euros. The draft code didn't specify how much news media businesses should be paid. Instead, it provided a negotiating process in which Google and Facebook had to take part. If there was no agreement, the process was designed to move to compulsory final offer arbitration. The arbitration panel had to select one of the final offers of the parties. This is a process sometimes called baseball determination. The decision of the arbitrator was to be binding. Now, in response to the draft code, Facebook threatened to exit the provision of news links in Australia if the code became law. Google was a bit more creative. It had warnings on Google search saying that search would no longer work if the code became law, warnings on YouTube that search would no longer work in YouTube if the code became law, and a really great YouTube video with a comedian explaining why the code was a really bad idea. What I'd like to do is to have a look at final offer arbitration, because arbitration was exactly what Facebook and Google had asked for, but they'd asked for commercial arbitration. They'd looked for a solution that said, well, we want arbitration as being the outcome of a process of dealing with news media businesses, but they hadn't asked for final offer arbitration. Now, before I do this, I'm going to go back and use some really old ideas that were proposed by Roger Fisher and William Ury in a, I'd have to admit, a coffee table, as an airport book called Getting to Yes. Now, this was a book on negotiation for business people that came up with a couple of ideas. One of them was BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. That is your walk-away position. And if a party has an understanding of what your best alternative is and what the other person's best alternative to a deal is, then you can use that to find the zone of potential agreement, or ZOPA. So most commercial agreements and most commercial negotiations use these concepts. If you're not going to be close on doing a deal, it's much easier to walk away now than to spend hours of fruitless time knowing that you're not going to be able to settle on a deal. If you're not going to have, at the end of the day, an overlapping ZOPA, if there's no potential for agreement, walk away now rather than waste your time. if there's an environment where there's a large imbalance in bargaining power, there's a very high likelihood that there'll be no overlapping ZOPA between the parties and no prospect of agreement. And so the idea behind a final offer arbitration was to try and force the parties to come to an agreement where you might actually get to an outcome which is more likely to have an overlap. Now, in Australia, there are already mandatory codes of conduct where there is an imbalance of bargaining power between two parties. And a good example of this is the franchising code of conduct. There is a horrible imbalance between any one franchisee and a large franchisor. This is where I think there's a difference between some of the legal scholars, for example, me, and some of the economists, including my friend Richard Holden. Richard says, friend, colleague, and also from UNSW, University of New South Wales, Richard says it's horribly economically inappropriate for there to be intervention, to have a regulatory determination that there's an imbalance of bargaining power and therefore to have a code. And he's an economist. I sort of say, yeah, but it's a practical solution. And as was mentioned, I used to be a regulator before I became an academic, and I see this as a way of perhaps pragmatically solving a problem. One way to achieve a negotiated outcome in the face of this larger imbalance is this final offer arbitration. It's sometimes referred to as baseball arbitration, and this label comes from the fact that it's used in Major League Baseball in the US for certain forms of player salary settlements. In final offer arbitration, each party proposes their final offer after a period of negotiation. The arbitrator or arbitral panel must select one or other of the final offers. It was first described back in 1966 by Carl Stevens in the context of employment negotiations. It's reasonably widely used in commercial agreements. The intention in such agreements is to have both contract parties negotiate a solution acceptable to each without the more common escalation of a dispute internally within both parties. In such a context, there's often an agreement by the parties that no other form of alternative dispute resolution be used. The arbitrator might be an expert determinator or an expert adjudicator rather than the traditional arbitral panel. In addition, final offer arbitration has been used in international trade law, international tax agreements, and by the FCC in media communications, licensing, program access, retransmission consent, and other disputes. There have been other areas of regulation where final offer arbitration either is or could be an appropriate approach. It has had some successes and some failures. Now, as a result of the situation in Australia, there was some success and some failures. In practice, Google struck commercial deals with all of the major and most of the minor news media businesses for access to Google Showcase. It's a great outcome. Google promised Google Showcase in the voluntary phase, as I mentioned, but didn't deliver. It was part of the reason that a mandatory code was imposed. A commercial outcome was achieved. Prices estimated about 150 million Australian dollars. There was no regulatory intervention other than the threat, and that suggests the process worked. It's actually quite interesting. The media companies had suggested that the value should be about $1 billion. Google and Facebook had said the value should be about 0. 150 million looks like about the right number. Now, Facebook blocked services to information providers in Australia after the code had passed the lower house of Parliament. That action was consistent with a reasonable threat of capital strike by a foreign direct investor in respect of new regulation it regarded as potentially harmful. Sadly, Facebook's world-leading algorithms couldn't determine the difference between a television station and the National Weather Service, or between Rupert Murdoch and a cancer charity. It also blocked Australia's health services at a time of in the middle of a pandemic, and that was problematic in the extreme. The response of the government at the time was fairly simple. You block our presence, we won't buy advertising. It then turned out pretty much the next day that Facebook's algorithms had somehow erred. And by the next day, only the news sites were blocked. And after some very minor amendments in the upper house, even these were returned. In the end, advertising revenue was the most important driver. However, Facebook has, so Rupert Murdoch, a children's cancer charity. However, Facebook has also made an awkward misstep because the ACCC is currently conducting its AdTech inquiry. One of the key issues here is algorithmic opacity. And the failure of Facebook's algorithms to differentiate between a radio station and a state government's COVID advice might be consistent with its attempt to differentiate itself from Google in the AdTech space. I'd say, though, that Facebook has subsequently also achieved, I'd have to say, though, that Facebook's also achieved commercial outcomes with a number of news media businesses, including News Corporation. The final form of the final offer arbitration in Australia is a hybrid with a mediation round where the mediator is drawn from a panel. The inclusion of mediation means that there's a reasonable likelihood that the two offers will actually settle. It's inconsistent that you wouldn't actually get to a potential round where the two parties are in their zopa if you've got to a position of mediation. But even if you go to the mediation round, there's a test. Sorry, to the arbitration round, there's a final test. And that is the arbitration panel has to check that the offer is consistent with the public interest. And I'd argue that this is a problem. There are a number of terms that have been used in contracts which have been identified by a number of authors, for example, Gian Casparo of Adelaide University, which are really difficult to build into smart contracts, which are similarly difficult to address in AI-based alternative dispute resolution. These terms include reasonableness, unconscionability, as well as duties of good faith and fair dealing. I realize I'm being very specific to contract law in a common law environment here. However, I'm going to suggest that being consistent with the public interest is a test with a similar level of complexity and intractability as reasonableness. It's one that challenges those with a duty to act in that interest, and I'm not sure how to direct someone to code for it. Then again, I'm looking forward to a discussion that will indicate that there's an algorithmic solution that I've missed. Thanks.